Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the case of Patrick Convery and the murder of John Docherty, which took place in the Jarrow area in 1868. I hope you will find it interesting. The past lives of those involved in this week's case was quite difficult to find, so their backstories will be quite basic. Patrick Convery was said to be around 36 years old at the time the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1832. Patrick was born in Ireland and originally moved to Liverpool before settling in Jarrow. He worked as a labourer at Palmer's shipyard. Patrick was married and lived with his wife and mother-in-law. It is not known if he had any children, and Patrick was described as someone who was an excellent marksman. John Docherty, the victim, was said to be around 25 years old at the time of his death, so would have been born in around 1843. Also born in Ireland, John appears to have followed the shipbuilding industry and also worked at Palmer Shipyard in Jarrow. Some considerable time in the past, John had lodged at the home of Patrick and his wife, but he had left due to the fact that Patrick was jealous of the time that he spent with his wife, and the two men do not seem to have been on good terms for several years. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do find this video interesting, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is very much appreciated, and it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. On the evening of November the 28th, 1868, Patrick Convery was returning to his home in Jarrow. He was a little drunk at the time, and as he walked up his street, he saw his wife leaving the home of one of his neighbours. This also happened to be where John Docherty lived. Patrick did not like John, as he did not like how close he was to his wife, and Patrick's wife's name, by the way, was unknown. It was never mentioned. Patrick continued to his own home, where, being very angry at the time, he spoke to his wife and argued with her about her visiting John. He then left the house and headed back to where John lived. On going inside, he argued with John, which led to the two men fighting. The fight was broken up by several women in the house, and Patrick left and went back to his own house. In his own home, Patrick took a gun from a drawer, loaded it and placed it into his pocket. He then went back to where John lived and shouted for him to come outside and fight. At first, John did not come out, but when Patrick swore at him, he went out and began to head towards him. When he was just a few yards away from him, Patrick took the gun from his pocket, aimed and fired, hitting John in the chest. Patrick ran away, and John, who was bleeding badly but still on his feet, began to chase after him. Thomas Hackett, who had been in the street, also began to chase Patrick, and he caught up to him first and pushed him to the ground. John then fell on top of both of the men. When Thomas tried to move John, he realised he was dead. The police were sent for, and several men who had now come out into the street kept hold of Patrick until the police arrived. He was then arrested for the willful murder of John Docherty and was taken to the police station. The inquest was held at the Golden Lion Inn in Walter Street in Jarrow before Coroner Fable. Mrs. Bridget Harney said that she had identified the body as being that of John Docherty, who had lodged at her home for the past few years. She said that around 7:30 p.m. on the night of the 28th, Mrs. Convery called at her house while John was at home. She had left around 10 minutes later. She said around 15 minutes after that, Patrick came to the house. She said she'd asked him why he had called there when he didn't like his wife visiting. She said he did not reply, as John had spoken before he could. John had asked him if he had argued with his wife because of him, and Patrick said he had, saying he had struck his wife over John. Bridget said the two men then began to fight. She said they fell onto the bed. She went to the neighbours for help, and several women came in and tried to separate the two men. She said John was holding Patrick down, and he asked to be allowed to get up. She said John told him, "I could kill you, but I would not like the sin of you upon my soul." She said Patrick then got up and left the house. Bridget said around 15 to 20 minutes later, Patrick returned to her house and began to shout outside. She said they asked who he was shouting for, and he said, John. He wanted John to come out and fight. She said John was willing to go out, but with the help of another of her neighbours, they had, at first, held him back. However, Patrick said he was not man enough to fight, and this made John angry, and he broke free and began to head towards Patrick. Bridget said a few seconds later she saw a flash and heard the sound of a gunshot. She said John cried out, Bridget, I am shot in the heart. She said she took hold of him in her arms and heard him speak to another man in the street, telling him to take hold of Patrick and send for the police. She said just after this, John was carried into her house and a doctor was sent for, but John was already dead. When asked, Bridget said Mrs. Convery had spoken of how her husband had badly used her, but she did not say what he had done. She said she had offered her a drink of rum, but she had refused. She said she had spoken to John, saying it was a bad thing how Patrick treated his wife. She denied that John had ran after Patrick after he'd been shot, saying she did not see him run anywhere. He was too weak. Mary Ann Moses said she had been in Mrs. Harney's house in Jarrow on the night of the 28th when Patrick arrived. She said Bridget had asked him why he did not like his wife visiting, and she said Patrick said he simply did not want her to come there. She said she did not hear any of the conversation between John and Patrick, but John seemed to raise his hand as if to strike Patrick, but she did not actually see him hit Patrick. She said when the men began to fight, she had been sent out to find help at the neighbour's house. Mary said when she returned, Patrick was being held on the bed and was asking to get up. She said with the help of the neighbours, they tried to separate the men. She said Patrick was eventually freed and left the house. She herself left as well, and she said she did not see John again until after he had been killed. Jane Bishop of Jarrow said she had gone into the home of Mrs. Harney around 9 p.m, and at that time only John and Mrs. Harney were there. She said Patrick Convery came down to the house and started shouting outside. He was calling for John to come out and fight with him, saying he was ready for him. She said John went outside and she and Mrs. Harney followed. They held on to John's arms. He asked Patrick what he wanted him for, and Patrick said to fight. She said John broke free from their grasp and ran towards Patrick. Jane said she then heard the sound of a gunshot and saw John fall. He cried out that he was shot, and she also said that she had not seen John run after Patrick after he'd been shot. Thomas Hackett of Jarrow said he lived in the same row of houses as Mrs. Harney, and on the night of the 28th he heard someone outside shouting. They were swearing and calling for John Docherty to come out and fight with them. He said he went outside to see what was going on. He said Patrick was standing in the street and John was standing near to the door of his home. Mrs. Harney and another woman were trying to hold him back and make him go inside, but Patrick was still name-calling, and John suddenly broke free from the women and went towards Patrick. Thomas said as John advanced, he saw Patrick put his hand in his pocket, pull out a gun and fire it towards John. John cried out that he had been shot in the heart. Thomas said Patrick began to run away, and both he and John ran after him. Thomas said he caught him first and they fell to the ground, and John fell on top of them saying, I am shot, I am shot. He said Patrick said, are you? He then got up and walked away. He said he stayed with John, calling out to two other men to get hold of Patrick as he had just shot a man. Thomas said he thought John was dead, but he was taken home and a doctor was sent for, and while the other men held on to Patrick in the street, he had gone in search of a policeman and had returned with Sergeant Averill, who had arrested Patrick and taken him to the police station. Thomas's wife Mary gave very similar evidence to that of her husband. James Gillespie of Jarrow said he had found the gun on the street near to the shooting. Jane Story said she had found some caps on the ground near to where John had fallen, and Esther Hill said she had found a snuff box close to the scene containing gunpowder. Mary Charlton said Patrick Convery was her son-in-law and lived with her and his wife in Jarrow. She said on the night of the 28th, Patrick had argued with his wife about John. He had told her he would have his revenge on one or the other of them. She said she had never heard him threaten his wife before this. She said they had both gone out after this and left Patrick alone, and they did not see him again until after John had been shot. John's wife did not give any evidence. Sergeant Averill said he had been in Ormond Street in Jarrow on the night of the 28th when Thomas Hackett found him. He said, acting on information he received, he had gone to the scene of the crime with Thomas. He said he found Patrick on the ground with several men holding him down. He was given the gun by one of the men, which he said had recently been fired. He said he had arrested Patrick and taken him to the police station. Superintendent Salter said he had charged Patrick with the willful murder of John Docherty. He said Patrick had replied, saying, "I never had a gun, I never murdered anybody." He said he had later searched Patrick's home and had found 2 lead bullets which matched the bullet removed from the body of John Docherty. Celia Watson of Jarrow said she had been present in Patrick's home when he had taken the gun and placed it in his pocket. Patrick was allowed to question the witnesses, however no details were given of what he had asked or what replies he had been given. Dr. Wammond of Jarrow said he had been called to the home of John Docherty on the night of the 28th. When he arrived, John was lying on a bed. He was already dead. Dr. Wammond said he noticed the wound to his chest. It was around half an inch wide. Dr. Wammond said along with Dr. Huntley he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of John Docherty. He said the bullet had entered the left lung and caused internal bleeding. He said it was his professional opinion that death had been caused by internal blood loss. The bullet had not penetrated the heart. The coroner then spoke to Patrick, telling him there was a strong evidence to suggest he had caused the death of John Docherty by shooting him. He then asked if he had anything to say. Patrick replied that he had nothing to say right now. The coroner then spoke to the jury, telling them it was for them to decide if they felt Patrick had shot John in a moment of passion due to the fight and not thinking clearly. If so, then they could find in favour of manslaughter. If, however, they felt Patrick had time to cool down before he fired at John, then they must find in favour of willful murder. The jury, who retired for 15 minutes, returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder, and the coroner stated that he completely agreed with their verdict. Patrick, who had now burst into tears, was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for John Docherty. He does not appear to have had any family in the area, so it is very likely that this would again have been a case of a pauper's funeral. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for John anywhere in the area. The trial took place in Durham in December of 1884 before Mr. Justice Brett. Patrick pleaded not guilty to the charge of willful murder. And as is often the case, there is very little difference in evidence at the trial to that of the inquest, so I will only include any new information. Bridget Harney gave the same evidence as she had done at the inquest. However, when she was asked, she stated that John Docherty had struck the first blow in the earlier argument, saying he had struck Patrick in the face and caused it to bleed. Sergeant Averill added to his statement by saying that when he had arrested Patrick, he had been very much under the influence of drink. The prosecution spoke to the jury, stating that this was a clear case where a gun had been used in a cool, calm manner, fully aware of what may happen if it was used against another man. He did admit that he had not been able to prove that Patrick had been jealous of his wife and John for a long time, so it would be for the jury to decide how much this had played a part in the case. The defence spoke to the jury, stating that this was a clear case to be reduced to one of manslaughter. He said that Patrick had not intended to kill John. The argument had resumed and he had fired in anger, not with intent to kill. The judge, in summing up, stated that the jury simply had to decide if Patrick had intended to murder John when he fought with him that night, or if in the heat of the argument he had fired in anger and had not meant to kill. The jury retired for 45 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Patrick Convery. The judge then spoke to Patrick, telling him that the jury had taken a merciful view of the crime he had committed, a verdict that they had not come to lightly, but one with which he did agree. However, he had still been found guilty of a dreadful crime, and for this he would sentence him to 20 years penal servitude. Patrick was then removed from the dock and returned to prison. Sadly, I did not find out which prison Patrick was sent to serve out his sentence or when he was released, but it is to be hoped that he did not return to the area in later years. And I didn't find any details of his wife after this date either, but I do hope that she was able to live out the rest of her life in peace away from Patrick Convery. This was, again, another strange case. It was obvious that Patrick was jealous of John spending time with, meeting with, or seeing his wife. However, we have no evidence to state that he had reason to be jealous. Whether he did have reason or not, his jealousy led him to fight with John and resulted in the death of a young man who had all of his life still ahead of him. Why did Patrick's wife not give any evidence? Well, I did find this quite odd. If she had been innocent of any wrongdoing, then surely she would have come forward to speak of Patrick's irrational behaviour towards her. But this, of course, doesn't actually make her guilty. She may simply have been afraid to give evidence for fear that Patrick would be released and seek revenge on her for trying to have him sent to prison. Were the jury correct to find Patrick guilty of manslaughter? Well, to be honest, it is a hard one to call, but I personally feel they were not. He had returned to his home deliberately to get the gun, and if that's not someone intending to shoot another, then I don't really know what is. Perhaps they felt he had only meant to frighten John by having the gun, but I don't think that was the case. I think he should have been found guilty of murder. Was the judge correct to send him to prison for 20 years? Well, on this one, I think he was, but I also think that he could have given him a much longer sentence. But what do you think? Do you think there was something going on between John and Patrick's wife and that he had reason to be jealous? Or do you think Patrick was jealous for no reason at all? Do you think Patrick intended to kill John when he went back to find him with a loaded gun? Or do you think he shot him in the heat of the moment? Do you think the jury were correct to find him guilty of manslaughter? Or do you think he should have been found guilty of murder? And do you think the judge was correct to send him to prison for 20 years? Or should he have been given a much longer sentence? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next week.